Hi and welcome to REEF TV. I'm Bryan Wilcox, CEO at REEF. In this episode of REEF TV, we look at an issue which in recent times has become a hot topic of discussion throughout the real estate industry. I'm referring of course to the issue of using someone in the capacity of independent contractor as opposed to employing them as an employee. Joining me to look at this subject is Tim McDonald, partner with law firm Moray Agnew. Tim is an accredited specialist in employment and industrial law with the Law Society of New South Wales. Moray Agnew regularly advise and act to real estate agencies in employment litigation, particularly post-employment. Thanks for joining me, Tim, today to discuss what is clearly a very complex and problematic issue for our industry. Tim, as I know you are aware, REEF receives a considerable number of calls from our members and subscribers asking about the possibility of engaging someone to sell real estate for the business in the capacity as an independent contractor rather than as an employee. Can you provide a simple explanation, if possible, on the difference between an employee and a contractor and the indicators that would distinguish one from the other?
Thanks, Bryan. I suppose the fundamental question that the courts ask into trying to distinguish between contractors and employees is the person in the business on their own account, or are they simply an emanation of the employer's business? And the way that they do that is that they look at the contracts that are between the principals and the contractor or the employee, and then they also look at how the arrangement's working in practice. From there, they then look at various indicators about whether it has the hallmarks of a contract or employment relationship. So the courts would generally expect that if it's an independent contractor relationship, it's going to be a truly independent business. By that, it means that they have the freedom to operate the way that they want to. They're not going to be controlled by an employer. Also, they're able to set up the business and operate in the way that they see fit. So they're able to incorporate, they're able to employ staff, they're able to delegate, they're able to subcontract the work. And also that they operate on the basis that it's a commercial arrangement. So they invoice the principal for any work that they do, generally on a payment by results basis. They don't receive annual leave or wages or anything like that that would be akin to an employment relationship. The other thing is that they can put themselves out to the world at large as being an independent business. So they wouldn't necessarily be branded the same way. On the sales or agency agreement, it would have the name of the independent contractor's business rather than the principal's. So those sorts of distinctions are also important for the courts to look at that question. One of the difficult things, though, is that there's a real lack of certainty because you've got all these indicators that the courts will apply. Different judges will put different weights on different indicators. So sometimes it's very hard to be very certain about how a court's going to go in terms of characterising the relationship. The other thing to keep in mind is that what we've been talking about is an employment situation. So what I've discussed goes for entitlements under the Fair Work Act and whether the award applies and so forth. But there are different tests applicable for superannuation, different tests applicable for payroll tax and workers' compensation.
So what you're saying, Tim, is that the legal distinction between an employee and a contractor is actually quite complex. So if I'm a real estate principal and I'm wanting to engage a contractor, are there certain things that I should be looking at in terms of putting in place to protect myself?
I think the first thing that you should think about is whether the person that you're going to contract with as an independent contractor is really equipped to be able to do that. So you'd expect that they would have a proper business set up. They might be incorporated, for example. The second thing that you'd then want to do is make sure that you've got a really ironclad contract in place with with the independent contractor. So in particular, you'd want to make sure that it characterises the relationship as one of independent contracting rather than employment, and that it also is consistent with that type of relationship. So you wouldn't want to put in all sorts of controls that there might be over that business. You wouldn't want to have restrictions on them employing staff or requirements that they perform the work personally. That's going to fall more into the description of an employment relationship. The other thing that you've got to also think about, though, is that the obligations an independent contractor owes you are very different to those that an employee would owe to you. So, for example, in relation to confidential information, an employee owes you certain obligations in relation to your database and so forth. You can't necessarily expect the same thing from an independent contractor, so you need to give some thought as to how you're going to protect yourself in relation to those things. The other thing that you've got to give some thought to is that sometimes you have arrangements that everyone's happy with and you're not really worried about the independent contractor causing you any difficulties. But you've also got to remember that there are other entities that may not have the same interests. So the tax office, for example, might be wanting to make sure that superannuation's been paid. The Office of State Revenue may be after payroll tax. Workers' compensation authorities want to make sure that can be paid. So you've got to be careful that those sort of situations don't arise where third parties, if you like, are perhaps raising questions. The other thing that you've got to also consider is that there might be other third parties who may want to sue the independent contractor, and in those sort of circumstances you want to make sure that there's some sort of protection for you in that situation, that they've got proper insurance and so forth, and that they are properly indemnifying you under the contract.
So clearly there's some risks and potential consequences if a contractor is actually found to be an employee by the courts. Could you elaborate on that for me? Most
certainly. The independent contracting model can work very well while it's all in the sense that there's people quite often enjoy that independence. It's often simpler for the principal. But when things go wrong in that relationship, things can go very wrong. And that's where we often get involved, because people have operated on the assumption that there's been, an independent contracting relationship for many years, and then it's found to be an employment relationship. And if you think about it, with the employee entitlements such as annual leave, for example, all of a sudden that independent contractor who's now an employee can claim those sort of things back going to when the engagement started. They need to be concerned about annual leave, long service leave, various other award entitlements, which can amount up to some very big amounts. As well as employee entitlement issues, you need to also be concerned about some of those tax authorities. For example, Office of State Revenue might come after you for payroll tax, the tax office might come after you for superannuation guarantee, and also you can be pursued for unpaid workers' compensation entitlements.
Well, Tim, I suppose the question that comes to mind from this is it actually possible to lawfully engage a person or an entity to sell real estate in conjunction with a principal agency?
It's certainly possible, but it's not without risk. And I think you need to be very conscious of those risks, and you need to try and mitigate against those. And two of the ways that I've suggested you might be able to do that is, firstly, make sure that you're contracting with something that's a legitimate, genuine, independent business. And secondly, making sure that your contract is making sure that it's consistent with there being an independent contracting relationship. There are also various things that you can put in the contract to try and give you some protection in relation to situations where the contract falls apart for one reason or another in relation to various indemnities and so forth. So it's important, I think, to think about those things in a very broad sense when you go into this type of relationship. But I think if it's just a standard sort of situation where someone might be a salesperson on a commission-only basis and there's nothing else to suggest that it's an independent contracting relationship, it may be a very difficult thing to defend if you went to court.
I also understand that there's some sham contracting provisions prescribed under the Fair Work Act. Could you give us a brief explanation on the impact of these provisions and how they're different to the matters that we've already discussed today?
Yeah, so what we've talked about is underpayment of entitlements being pursued or various other liabilities. This is a bit different again in that if there's been sham contracting, then fines can be imposed by courts upon you. And you've got the Fair Work Ombudsman now, which is a very strong prosecuting body, which will prosecute principals if they believe that there's been sham contracting. And by sham contracting, what I'm suggesting is that where employers know that they're really employing someone but want to put a label of an independent contractor on it, which they shouldn't, or they're otherwise misrepresenting the relationship. In those sorts of circumstances, the types of fines that you can be faced with are fines well in excess of $50,000.
Well, Tim, thanks for that excellent, if not a little overwhelming overview on this complex topic of independent contractors.
Thank you, Bryan.
Thanks for watching this episode of REEF TV. Don't miss our other episodes that deal with a range of employment topics to help you stay on top of the latest workplace relations information and news. See you next time.